On Monday mornings, just about mid 40ish, we are joined on a weekly basis by Randy Stapilus from Idaho Weekly Briefing. And as I said before, Randy could be considered the dean of journalism in Idaho. In fact, in the last couple of weeks, we've talked about all the other people that he had worked with or was acquainted with who are retiring. So it's not to say that he's old, he's just been at it for a very, very long time. And first of all, welcome back to the program.
Good to be here.
Uh, this story about Representative Heather Scott, I thought would quiet down, but apparently it's still got a lot of legs in the old journalism vernacular, doesn't it?
It's still kind of out there. There are aspects that people can still talk about. I did my column this weekend on the question of, well, if she's not right, as I think she is not, as a lot of other people say that she is not right about the way women advance in the Idaho legislature. Then how do women and men, for that matter, advance in the legislature? And I thought it was kind of interesting to review that a little bit, just kind of the way things work there, which is it's not too different in the Idaho legislature from a lot of other places. Some of the details and rules vary from place to place, but the basics are usually fairly similar. You'd find some similar kind of principles in Congress, for that matter.
You had mentioned that going all the way back into the 1970s, there were always. I mean, it happens in any large group that there are going to be people who are having affairs. People get attracted to each other. I do know that Speaker Bedke had said something to the effect that she's impugning the morals of this body. But that said, people in the public, I mean, they don't necessarily believe that these people are up on Mount Olympus in the first place. And
Oh no, and well, they're not. uh, they're not any more than any other people are. They're just a group of people, and they're subject to the same flaws, temptations, weaknesses, and everything else that other people are. That's there's nothing that wildly spectacular in that sense. They're just people. Really no better, no worse. And the environment there usually kind of forces a kind of almost rigidity that keeps some of these kinds of things in check. It's kind of a natural tendency after a while when you run into people that either you don't like or you disagree with a lot, that you might get into loud arguments with them, and things could go downhill from there. Well, there are rules in the legislature that prevent you, at least in public speech, from disparaging other people or the institution, and that's why it's there. It's intended to force some rules with the idea that that you're going to have people that you're going to disagree with or maybe you don't like, but you all have to get along in order to do this job. So, that the rules kind of help a little bit, but some things like that, yeah, I made the reference to affairs and things like that were going on that I saw many years ago, and from time to time it will happen. It has we've had the one difference between years ago and recently is that recently we've had some headlines about that subject. Years ago, it managed to pretty much stay out of the news, but I mean, people who were around, reporters and staff and other legislators, pretty much, if you're around a closed environment for long enough, it's the same as it would be in a small town. You kind of know, you kind of figure it out.
the thing I think a lot of people may be overlooking with this, and since we were so wrong on the national politics this last year, is that Scott has sometimes said I'm sorry, and then at times pulled back from saying I'm sorry, then said I'm sorry again. That there are people out there who like that sort of rebel stance, and it makes me wonder if indeed that she's looking at a potential challenge to somebody, perhaps in a primary for Senate, U.S. Senate, or something along those lines, because she has certainly if people didn't know who she was in the state before all of this transpired, they certainly know now. And that rebel image can do great things in politics sometimes.
Well, and in Idaho, it certainly can. There's precedent for that. That's a very good point. I think that it's she on the basis of some of that, in a little quieter way. She'd already become a bit of a statewide name even before all of this had happened. Uh, Her participation with the Malheur Refuge activists, the occupiers over there, the Confederate flag, the questions about whether some of her supporters were harassing uh, other political people in the area. Uh, there's been enough that she could kind of claim some of that mantle for herself. And if you wind up with a situation, yeah, I could imagine in, for example, the first congressional district, if Raul Labrador wound up running for governor next time around, I would not be at all shocked to see Heather Scott running for that spot. That would, or something else. Who knows?
I want to mention Randy Stapilus is our guest during the course of this half hour, and we're at 8:49. I'll call it. We're pretty close to that. 32 right now. Bill Colley with you as well on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX News Radio 1310.com if you're listening online. Speaking of online, this one I thought was upgrade, as one of my old editors once told me, was the worst word in the English language. But the state is thinking about an upgrade to its website.
Well, it has started to do that. Usually, these things do kind of take a little while to settle in as website upgrades. Uh, Sorry about that, but website changes or improvements or alterations in any event tend to. It doesn't look, from what I've seen of it, and I was looking through it this last weekend. Doesn't look all that dramatically different, and some parts of it haven't changed much at all. Uh, what I've seen of state website changes like this over the years is that they tend not to be totally complete, and they tend in that there are agencies that usually do remain as outliers from it. Some kind of get into the pattern, and some take their time, and it may take a little while for it to fully spread and fully implement. It on balance looks a little cleaner and a little snappier than it did before, I think. But part of it, I suppose, is that as with a lot of organizations, every so often you just kind of feel a need to adjust it and make some changes. There are some technological changes that the state made in it that are do have some significance to it. A couple of years ago, I needed to redesign my website with the idea that it needed to be more visible and accessible on things like smartphones and tablets and things like that. And so I made kind of a sweeping change in the design of it. And the state's redesign has been done with some of that same kind of idea in mind, that you have to uh, be able to access the state site on things like smartphones and tablets and so forth. A lot of people are doing it that way, and you have to make sure that you're keeping up.
Speaking of websites, you mentioned yours. If people would like to know more, where would they go?
They would go to ridenbaughpress.com, RIDENBAUGH press.com.
The one thing that I think in government that they strive to do is to try to make it more user friendly whenever they can, because we've all had experience with websites, and I know designers like to leave their own mark, but sometimes they can be very, very confusing. And from a government standpoint, the goal would be to try to make this as easy as possible for users.
Yes, that ought to be really ought to be kind of goal one, is to make it as intuitive as you can, to make it as easy to get around it, to make it obvious how you get to what you want to get. And I think the redesign that they've put in place does, at least from the initial look of it, does a pretty reasonable job of that. But It's one of those things that I think people who do use it might be able to benefit by providing some input to the state webmasters and tell them what works for them and what doesn't. Because sometimes when you're designing these things, it's not always immediately obvious what's going to be intuitively apparent to somebody else and what isn't.
You mentioned that, and I'm reminded of the old story from Honda when they came out with the Odyssey, and there was something along the line of 20 cup holders in it, and it was because the engineers literally sat down. This doesn't often happen, at least it didn't traditionally in the automobile industry. They sat down and they said, "Okay, how do people use our product?" And if you can answer the questions from that direction, you can build from that direction, and it's good for business.
It's not a bad idea. It's a useful idea really for just about anybody who's trying to communicate with the public, whether that's a business or a government or nonprofit or whatever it may be.
I saw a note from a legislator the other day, and it said, and I've heard this story that Idaho does not have something along the lines of the castle doctrine as it appears in Florida law, but it looks as if this is a bill that's going to be worked this session. Doesn't mean it's going to pass. What do you know about that? Is there the possibility that change is coming?
Well, there's a possibility. It's The castle doctrine has been brought into focus in a number of other states, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's more attention on it in Idaho. As much interest as there is certainly in the law as it relates to guns and matters like that, I wouldn't be too surprised at all if it becomes a topic of discussion over this next session. And you never know; a subject like that can sometimes take off and just fly right through.
And it seems we've been moving in that direction. It was interesting that when obviously the concealed carry, a permitless concealed carry, was passed last summer. Now some other states are also looking at it because they're looking at now they have a year to look at this. They're looking at Idaho's example to see how it worked. So it may well be that Idaho is becoming the test lab for a lot of these changes in gun laws.
Well, we'll see. There are several states that have been changing their gun related laws. Idaho is certainly one, and there are several others too. And I imagine there'll be eyes on all of them. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of these things, at least the effort to pass some of these things, starts to spread a little bit further.
I didn't bring it up in the email response, but you have a story about Senator Risch and regulation, business regulation, and I just read a moment ago. I just saw a bulletin that the Trump White House says they may cut regulations by 75% or more at the federal level. So Jim Risch could be right in the forefront of all of this.
Well, we'll see what happens there. Regulations are one of those things that you there are all kinds of them. Some of them are life saving, and some of them are foolish and unnecessary. But you kind of need to go through one by one. And if you're simply whacking out pages of regulation without reading what they're saying or understanding why they're there, uh, well, you could wind up with some unfortunate situations.
Uh, it I think about meat processing. Now, you want someone actually looking over what takes place there. On the other hand, land use and things like that might be simpler changes.
Well, could be. There are places where there isn't really a process in the federal government, and this is something that probably could be very productively done to institutionalize the review of laws and rules to determine whether something is uh, doing what it was intended to do, whether what it was intended to do is something that's good to that we should be doing, whether possibly this is something that was once useful and relevant but no longer is. We don't really have a mechanism for actively reviewing those kinds of things for the most part on either the federal or the state level. There are a few examples in some states where there's some effort being made to do some of that. Texas has done some of that, But for the most part, there's no institutionalized effort to review these things, and so they just tend to sit and accumulate. And I think that's part of where the some of the frustration does come in.
Randy, quickly for people who are tuning in today, what's the website address?
It is ridenbaughpress.com, RIDENBAUGH press.com.
We'll speak next Monday morning.
That sounds good.
Randy Stapilus joining us today from Idaho Weekly Briefing, as he does on Monday mornings between 8:40 and 9 o'clock. We're coming up on 9 o'clock news. Fox, of course, is just ahead. But following the news, we're going to be talking to Andrew Campanella. He is the national president for School Choice Week. And we have a big event taking place in Boise this morning. And as I said earlier, 154 such events just in Idaho alone this week. And he'll give us a breakdown on all of this. Idaho has a little bit more school choice than most states have, but it is becoming a hot issue, especially with the new nominee for the Department of Education in Washington, Betsy DeVos.